Hi everyone, it's Katrina. You think you know history? Think again. Unbelievable artifacts recovered from an ancient shipwreck are only the tip of the iceberg in today's video. Hidden beneath layers of dirt and time, archaeologists are uncovering secrets that challenge everything we thought we knew. Get ready to have your mind blown by some of the strangest and most bizarre archaeological finds ever, with a bit of a twist. Not everything is as it seems. The amazing relics of the Rooswijk. The legendary Rooswijk shipwreck has surrendered over 2,500 mind-boggling artifacts. You won't believe the astonishing relics that have been brought up from the bottom of the sea. The Rooswijk shipwreck was found off the coast of Kent in England. It was a ship with the Dutch East India Company that sank in the year 1740, only 3 years after it was built. The Dutch East India Company was founded almost 150 years earlier and became incredibly wealthy by transporting goods across the world. The company specialized in trading spices, but also made a bundle by trading enslaved human beings through colonization. It was a truly ugly business. Captained by Daniel Ronsiers, the ship began its final journey on January 8th, leaving the Netherlands bound for Jakarta. You can make this trip today in a couple of hours by plane, but in 1740, it took 8 months by sea. Could you handle that much time on a rickety old trading vessel? I don't think so. The Rooswijk never reached Jakarta. It barely got out of the Netherlands. The vessel ran into Goodwin Sands during a storm and sank off the coast of England. It wasn't seen again until amateur diver Ken Welling found it in 2005. The boat had been buried in the sands for 265 years. When the ship sank, all 237 people on board sank with it. As of right now, only 29 of the fallen sailors have been identified. The names of the rest have been completely lost to history. And now for the treasure. When the Rooswijk left the Netherlands, it was packed full of very real loot. I'm talking pirate booty. Enough treasure to make Blackbeard squeal. The ship was a treasure trove, carrying about 300,000 guilders in gold and silver. Massive silver bars formed the bulk of the silver cargo, while Spanish reals comprised the gold. But the coins aren't the most exciting part of the discovery. Archaeologists recovered some gold and silver, but they also found weapons. A lot of weapons. It was like a medieval arms deal gone bad. You know how in the movies the bad guys have wooden crates filled with bazookas and machine guns? Well, archaeologists found the same thing, only instead of RPGs, the boxes contained swords. 5 whole chests of saber blades were found, each blade intricately designed with images of the sun, moon, and stars. Some were even etched with a weaving snake design. The blades weren't attached to handles, just like guns don't automatically come with bullets. It was only the blades, which were presumably being traded to warriors in Jakarta. Some treasures didn't stand up so well to the salt water. For example, archaeologists found stacks of thimbles held together by a couple hundred years of rust that they can't extract without breaking them. The thimbles all melted together kind of look like medieval armor. Murder victim or ancient princess? Or both? When is a mummy not a mummy? Maybe when it's a murder victim? Does that count? You're about to be dragged into one of the weirdest archaeological discoveries / murder investigations in human history. In the year 2000, the New York Metropolitan Museum received 4 Polaroid photographs of what looked like a mummy. Oscar Muscarella was the man who investigated the photos. They looked mostly correct to him. The photos even came with the translation of a cuneiform inscription on the mummy's golden breastplate. It was believed this mummy was a Persian princess. She was the daughter of legendary Persian king Xerxes. You might be familiar with King Xerxes. He was the guy who got angry at the sea and had his soldiers whip the waves to punish it. He was the man with all of those piercings and the deep rumbling voice in the movie 300. This mummy was supposed to be his daughter. If true, the mummy would be priceless and the museum had to have it. But Muscarella was a little skeptical. He had some nagging doubts about the authenticity of the translation. In the end, he refused to purchase the mummy because he had a very bad feeling. And that was it, at least for Muscarella. A few months later, police in Pakistan arrested a man named Ali Akbar on suspicion of selling an illegal mummy. It turned out the illicit mummy was the one in the photographs sent to the New York Metropolitan Museum. Case closed, right? Absolutely not. The mummy was taken to the National Museum in Karachi, where it was presented at a press conference as the body of a Persian princess from 600 BC. Everyone assumed the mummy was real. Word spread and drama broke out across the globe. Iran freaked out because they wanted the mummy since she was Persian. There was a debate over who rightfully owned the mummified body of Xerxes' daughter. Controversy aside, everyone involved in the debacle was about to be seriously embarrassed. As nations fought over who the mummy belonged to, it was being analyzed by scientists at the National Museum of Pakistan. At first, things seemed normal enough. The mummy was inside a wooden sarcophagus, her body stretched out on a reed mat. Her sarcophagus was decorated with a gold mask. The inscription on the breastplate declared, "I am the daughter of the great King Xerxes. I am Rodugune." There were too many inconsistencies with the inscription, starting with grammatical errors. The princess's name wasn't even the right one. Rodugune was her Greek name. Her true Persian name was Wardegauna. Scientists knew something funny was going on, and not something ha-ha funny. When they radiocarbon dated the reed mat she was lying on, the test came back showing it was only 50 years old. The princess was supposed to have been buried 2,600 years ago. Next up was a full analysis of the body. This was when researchers broke the case wide open. They found something so scary it's hard to believe even today. The mummy did belong to an adult woman, but she died in 1996. 1996 AD, as in 4 years before the pictures were sent to New York. Further tests showed that the woman's neck was broken. Forensic evidence pointed to someone strangling her to death. Nations were fighting over the rights to a Persian princess who was actually a recent murder victim. Talk about things not turning out the way they appear. Pakistani police launched an investigation, but it's been more than 20 years and no progress has been made. It's believed that somebody killed an unidentified woman, mummified her themselves, and then tried to sell her to the Metropolitan Museum. I'm kind of speechless right now. The Runamo rune mistake. What if the most famous Viking inscription ever discovered was nothing more than an elaborate hoax? Some of the coolest Viking runes in the world also happen to be some of the most controversial. For centuries, locals thought it was impossible to read the Runamo runes in Sweden. But it turns out they might not say anything at all. They might not even be runes. In the 12th century AD, Danish author Saxo Grammaticus wrote that the runic inscription at Runamo was no longer legible because it was too worn out. Saxo said King Valdemar I of Denmark sent a delegation of scholars to try and read the inscription. This was in the mid-1100s. Unfortunately for the king's scholars, they failed to read the runes. Not to worry though, because for some reason, Saxo had a translation of them handy. Saxo explained in his book that the Runamo runes were written as a memorial to the Danish king Harald Wartooth, not to be confused with Harold Bluetooth. Saxo even gives a detailed translation of the runes in his book. The runes supposedly say, Harold, being of great beauty and unusual size, and surpassing those of his age and strength and stature, received such favor from Odin that steel could not injure his perfect soundness. The runes go on like that for a while, rambling on and on about how great Harold is and how many souls he sent to the afterlife with his sword. It's all very dramatic and exactly what you would expect from a Viking king. Brace yourself now for some disappointment. Scientists don't think the Runamo runes are real. Scientists think the runes are nothing but cracks in the ground that just happen to look like runes. What a weird case of mistaken identity. If modern scientists are right, scholars have been fighting each other to make sense of cracks on a dolerite dike for more than 800 years. It's like a bunch of linguists trying to decipher cracks on the sidewalk that they think are Egyptian hieroglyphics. Even though Saxo claimed the runes were impossible to read in the 12th century, Danish physician Ole Worm, yes, that was his name, declared that he could read some of them in the 17th century. Then, in the 19th century, Swedish writer Esaias Tegnér claimed the runes were an unfinished poem about a giantess named Garor. In Norse mythology, Garor was a goddess from Jotunheim who was married to Freyr. Could this be a classic example of wishful thinking pushed to the extreme? How in the world did scholars translate cracks in the ground into full-blown poetry? The mummies of Pompeii. Mummified bodies at Pompeii paint a terrifying picture of history's most famous natural disaster. But the petrified mummies that you see today in the ruins of Pompeii are not what you think. They pretend to be real human remains, but they aren't. Almost 3 million visitors descend on the ancient town every year, but they don't know the full story. On a late October day in 79 AD, Pompeii suffered an apocalypse. They must have thought the gods decided to destroy humanity. Mount Vesuvius erupted 5 miles from the wealthy resort town. The region was flooded with a noxious cloud of superheated gas while molten rock and hot ash fell from the sky. What you see in Pompeii today are the famous stone bodies of the people who were caught in that apocalypse. Except you are not exactly looking at poor souls caught off guard. Most people imagine the citizens of Pompeii running and screaming while a wave of hot molten rock slowly washed over the town, turning its victims into immortal stone statues like Medusa went on a rampage. But that's not quite what happened. What you see today in Pompeii is not the real result of the volcanic massacre. In fact, if you had visited Pompeii prior to the 1800s, you wouldn't even have seen the bodies. Professor Mary Beard from the University of Cambridge said that the petrified stone bodies are not bodies at all. What you are looking at are molds of the empty space left by a body. When archaeologists were digging through the layers of debris and ash, they started finding human-shaped cavities. Sometimes the cavities contained burnt human remains. It didn't take archaeologists long to figure out what happened. When volcanic debris fell onto Pompeii, it killed people, they died from the heat, and they died from the poison gas. They weren't transformed into statues. Instead, the material from the volcano covered their dead bodies and solidified around them. Over the centuries, the flesh and internal organs of the victims decomposed. The clothing decomposed as well. This left a human-shaped void inside the hardened volcanic material. Archaeologists realized that if they poured plaster into the human-shaped void, they could create an exact replica of the body. Mary Beard called it an antibody, since the replica is really a mold of where the body used to be. Archaeologists then put these molds around Pompeii to impress tourists. Tourists assumed they were statues of real people who had been turned into solid stone, but there are no bodies inside the statues, only plaster. And now for a quick break, but first I want to give a big shout out to Hockey and CP Tony for supporting this channel. Thanks so much for watching and spending time with us. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already for more videos like this. The Pint-sized Warriors of Oregon. A chilling discovery has revealed a dark secret about the training of ancient warriors. Tiny versions of ancient weapons were found in Oregon, and at first, archaeologists didn't know what they were dealing with. Now that they know what the ancient weapons were really for, the experts don't know what to think. It seems indigenous warriors were trained from a very, very young age. The Salish and Chinookan-speaking populations of Oregon have a lot more in common with the Spartans of Greece than most people realize. Robert Lucy, a scientist at the University of Alberta, uncovered a number of atlatls at an excavation on the Oregon coast that are roughly 1,200 years old. Atlatls were weapons used for throwing spears. The atlatl worked to boost the velocity of a spear or a javelin. You could throw a spear with only your arm strength, but that's not very effective, especially if you have arms like mine. The atlatl was a long shaft about the length of your arm. You rest your spear on it and then fling the atlatl forward to gain a massive amount of leverage, thus boosting the velocity of your weapon. The best comparison I can make is to a ball thrower that you use to toss your dog's tennis ball way farther than you could with your arm alone. A spear thrown with an atlatl has a much higher chance of impaling your enemy. It's why they were used across all of North America in ancient times. What Robert found in Oregon were no ordinary atlatls. They were too small to be used by fully grown adults. Robert said most atlatls that he finds fit comfortably in his hand, but these ones were half the normal size. They would have only fit comfortably in the hands of small 8-year-old children. The evidence points to kids being trained on how to use these deadly weapons. Native Americans created miniature atlatls and put them into the hands of youngsters no older than 8. Robert says it makes sense because the device was difficult to use. It would have required a lot of practice to get right. The smaller weapons meant that children could get started from an early age. Do you know any 8-year-olds you would trust with this? I don't. Of course, atlatls weren't always used for fighting. They were also used for hunting, which was critical to survival. The atlatls were gradually replaced by bows and arrows about 1,000 years ago. The Dropa stones. There are mysterious stone discs that prove aliens landed on Earth. That's the best way to introduce the Dropa stones, but there is more to the mystery than meets the eye. Nobody has ever seen the Dropa stones. Nobody has a single piece of evidence to prove they even existed. I'll tell you the tale of these unsuspecting artifacts and let you make your own decisions of what's real. It began in 1937 with an archaeological expedition led by Chi-Pu-Te into the Bayan-Har Mountains of China. The archaeologists uncovered 716 granite discs etched with small hieroglyphic markings. They looked like pieces of old machinery, like they belonged in some huge archaic mechanism. But according to Chi-Pu-Te, that should be impossible. He dated the granite discs at 12,000 years old. That would make them contemporary with the world's oldest temple, Göbekli Tepe. The discs were not the only oddities found in the Chinese mountains. There were also star maps and skeletons with unusually big heads. It looked as if the skeletons were not entirely human. They were roughly human-sized, but their anatomy didn't look quite right. This is where the story gets a little bit blurry. Chinese archaeologists studied the 716 granite discs at the Academy of Prehistory in Beijing for the next 20 years. It took all that time for them to translate the unusual markings. The translations they came up with are nothing short of extraordinary. Scientists concluded that the discs recorded an event that occurred long before human civilization began. Aliens crashed their ship in China and had no way to get back to their home in outer space. They died there in the mountains, but left behind messages carved into perfectly circular granite discs. The problem with these discs is that nobody knows where they are today. There are also no records of the discs being studied in China. Chi-Pu-Te doesn't appear to exist. There is no birth certificate or record of him studying at any university. Either nothing I just told you is true, or the whole expedition has been scrubbed from the history books. I can tell you that in 1974, an Austrian engineer by the name of Ernst Wegerer visited the Banpo Museum in Shanxi and allegedly saw 2 of the original Dropa stones. When he asked staff at the museum about the discs, he received no information, but he did take some pictures. By 1994, the discs were no longer in the museum. The pictures that Wegerer took are too low resolution to show any hieroglyphs on the stones, and in fact, they might not be the Dropa stones at all. Take a look at this picture. It looks like what you would imagine a Dropa stone to look like, right? It's a huge disc covered in strange markings. Only this is a B, a circular artifact produced in China from the Neolithic era to modern times. Some B discs are 5,000 years old. Some are made of jade, others of glass, and there could be some even made from granite. When B discs are buried underground, the minerals in the soil tend to change them, making them look even more ancient than they already are. Many experts believe what Ernst Wegerer photographed at the Banpo Museum were ordinary B discs. It's possible that what Chi-Pu-Te originally found in the Bayan-Har Mountains were also B discs. The whole thing about an alien crash could have been made up later and added to the story. What do you think? Are the Dropa stones normal artifacts or evidence of aliens? Let me know in the comments. And for more videos about strange, mysterious artifacts like this, be sure to subscribe. An expert fail. One of America's premier antiquities experts made an error of epic proportions on live TV. Probably their worst nightmare come to life. This is a perfect example of something being labeled as one thing when in reality it was completely different. Only in this instance, an expert was embarrassed and somebody lost out on $50,000. Antiques Roadshow, the American version, was filming in Spokane, Washington, when Stephen L. Fletcher was presented with a glazed redware jug decorated with 6 faces. The expert antiques appraiser compared the artifact to the work of Pablo Picasso. He said it was worth at least $50,000. Well, guess what? It wasn't even worth $5. The artifact in question was in the possession of Alvin Barr of South Carolina. Alvin said he found the relic at an estate sale in Eugene, Oregon. It was all covered in dirt and straw, and there were even chicken droppings on it. Even though it looked worthless, Alvin had to have it. He paid $300 for the thing. After the episodes of Antiques Roadshow aired in the US, a woman watching the show recognized the artifact. Stephen Fletcher dated the piece of pottery to the late 19th century, but the woman watching the show knew that it was made by her friend in a high school ceramics class in 1973. The apparent artifact wasn't ancient. It was made by Betsy Sewell of Oregon when she was a teenager. PBS had to correct the details of the appraisal on their website, revising its value to around $3,000. That's still not bad for an old high school art project. Stephen Fletcher chalked up his epic fail as a learning experience. As for Alvin Barr, I can only imagine his disappointment. For months, he thought he had a payday coming in that would change his life, but that was not the case. The garbage that changed history. Can a piece of garbage change history? It depends on what you want to believe. In 1961, Wallace Lane and 2 friends were out looking for geodes near Olancha, California. They collected their geodes, which are essentially mineral rocks, and took them home to investigate. One of the geodes contained an object that didn't make any sense. Inside the geode, embedded like a fossil, was a cylinder of porcelain with a small shaft of bright metal in the center. It appeared to be a spark plug. The amateur rock hunters didn't know what to think because the geode was at least 500,000 years old. This is what happens when a rock turns out to be something else entirely. News of the discovery spread like wildfire, and soon everyone had a theory of their own. One of the most popular theories was that the rock hunters had stumbled upon a piece of technology from the distant past. Maybe it was a spark plug. It was suggested that the spark plug was 500,000 years old. This would mean that there have been other iterations of human civilization on this planet. There was a culture with 20th century technology, but clearly something happened and they went extinct. In 1999, a group of skeptics X-rayed the artifact and determined it to be a spark plug from the 1920s. A few of its metal components had rusted away. It wasn't in a geode at all, it was just stuck to some old detritus. Even with the X-ray images, not everyone is convinced of the spark plug's meager origins. Some even think that the discovery is being covered up to keep our ancient history a secret. Not likely, but very fun theory. The Viking in the well. Sometimes you find a hole, and sometimes when you think you found a hole, you've actually found a grave. Archaeologists in Norway are busy investigating a skeleton discovered in a well on the grounds of a castle. The discovery was initially made in 1938 as Borg Castle, but it wasn't until 2016 that the body was recovered, and it wasn't until now that the results of a shocking DNA study have been released. It turns out the man in the well is a character in an Old Norse saga. The recently released study shows that the mystery man died in 1197. It's likely that he perished during a raid on the castle, which at the time was occupied by the Norwegian king Sverre Sigurdsson. The events of this raid are recorded in the Sverre saga, which was written about 100 years later. If you know much about the Norse sagas, you'll know this is a bombshell of a discovery. Up until now, no one from the Norse sagas has ever been found. Scientists know they existed, but their bodies have never been identified. This could be a world first. The Sverre saga is a prose narrative. It discusses King Sverre Sigurdsson's rise to power and the battles fought in the second part of the 12th century. During an attack on the castle in 1197, the saga claims that a dead man was thrown into the well outside to poison its water. The dating of the man found in the well matches perfectly. It goes to show you that you never know what you're going to find when you start poking around in a hole in the ground. The sarcophagus of Tarragona. It's a little frustrating that there are multiple Hercules sarcophagi out in the world, but not a single bone belonging to Hercules himself. When one such Hercules sarcophagus was found in the 19th century, it linked Spain to ancient Phoenicia and created a national scandal. In March of 1850, workers were quarrying stone for a project in the city of Tarragona in Spain. During their work, they uncovered a marble sarcophagus. The sarcophagus was covered in a bizarre series of inscriptions and carvings. However, this was 1850, and the workers didn't stop to preserve the little piece of history they found. The sarcophagus was broken, shattered into pieces. There was one man who cared, though. A local antiquarian named Don salvaged the fragments of the broken sarcophagus and took them home. In the center of one fragment, he recognized an image of Hercules. The image shows Hercules creating the Strait of Gibraltar, which comes from the myth of his 12 labors. More important than Hercules are the figures beside him. The image shows people migrating from a land of crocodiles and palm trees across the Strait of Gibraltar. This has been interpreted as Egyptian colonists moving to Spain. They would have had to cross all of northern Africa into Morocco and then gone up into Spain. This would mean that many Spanish people today have Egyptian heritage. But just wait, things get even crazier. Some ancient authors wrote that Hercules himself led an army into Spain, and that after his death he was buried in Cádiz. Could Hercules have been a real general from Egypt or Phoenicia? Here's another little piece of history you might not know. During the 15th dynasty of Egypt, a mysterious group of people known as the Hyksos controlled the country. Nobody knows where they came from or how they defeated the Egyptians, but they took over. It was only a couple centuries later that the Hyksos were expelled when the Egyptians rose up against them. Legend has it that the Hyksos fled to Spain and the Egyptians fled after them. The Egyptians ended up settling in Spain to either defeat or at least keep tabs on the Hyksos. The history of Egyptian colonists in Spain is murky at best. It's all legend and rumor. Nobody knows if Hercules led an army into Spain, and nobody knows what really happened to the Hyksos. One thing you should know about Spain is that ancient Egypt is embedded deep in their tradition. When the Hercules sarcophagus was found in 1850, Spanish nationalists used it as confirmation that they were indeed descendants of Egyptians. It turned out the sarcophagus was a fake. Our friend from earlier, Don, is believed to have fabricated the whole thing. There are other Hercules sarcophagi, real ones. One was found in Genzano di Roma and is currently at the British Museum. Another one found in Rome is on display in Florence in Italy. Both of them depict scenes from Hercules' 12 labors. It is possible that Hercules may have been a real man. Is this the first wheel? What if these tiny stones are the missing link between ancient tools and modern technology? Archaeologists can't decide if these 12,000-year-old stones are decorative pebbles or one of the oldest technologies in the world. The mysterious stones, so small they are hardly more than pebbles, were discovered at an archaeological site in Israel. Each tiny rock has a hole in it. Finding out what the hole was for is a lot tougher than it seems. 12,000 years ago was a critical time in human civilization. The earliest known temples in the world were built in Turkey. Technology was suddenly rushing forward. People went from using basic stone tools to developing real technologies, such as the wheel. Not the cartwheel, though. Not even the potter's wheel. One of the earliest rotational tools used by humans was the spindle whorl. A whorl is a round disc with a hole in it. You put a stick through the hole and then turn the disc to rotate the stick faster than you could with your bare hands. Tie a bit of fabric to the stick, and suddenly you are gathering fiber at superhuman speeds. Early humans who figured out how to do this cut their time for spinning fibers into yarn practically in half. The spindle whorl is so simple but also so important. Scientists believe it was the spindle whorl that helped lead to other wheel technologies, ultimately putting humans in the driver's seat of their own vehicles. Get it? But what about these stones found in Israel? Scientists think they might be spindle whorls, but they don't know for sure. They basically just found a bunch of rocks with holes in them and are thinking they might be ancient technology.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to stay tuned for extra content you might have missed. Ani Ruins. The mysterious ruins of Ani are a sight to behold in the country of Armenia. The ruins can be found on a secluded plateau overlooking a raging river, which forms the border between Armenia and Turkey. It's a ghost town, quite literally in the middle of nowhere. There is not a single town to be found nearby, and the valleys and mountains are totally undeveloped. It's one of the last great untouched landscapes, and that's what makes the ruins so incredible. Plus, it's extremely cold in the winter, and the ruins are typically covered in snow. This makes them even more magical than they would be otherwise. The ruins include one massive cathedral, 6 smaller and broken churches, and fields of shattered stone that once formed the walls of buildings. The city of Ani flourished in the 10th century as the capital of the Armenian kingdom. It actually controlled one of the biggest and most profitable sections of the Silk Road. However, the Mongol invasion in 1319 caused the city to lose its power. It was razed to the ground, and then it was broken even further by an intense earthquake. Ani was practically deserted, and the few people who remained found themselves absorbed into the Ottoman Empire in 1579. By 1735, the whole place was abandoned. Now the ruins sit quietly in nature, frozen in ice during the colder months. Glacier House. In the year 1886, the Rogers Pass section of the Canadian Pacific Railway's Trans-Canada Line opened for business. This was an incredibly dangerous part of the trail, with the train having to climb a steep grade through an area prone to avalanches. Nonetheless, the railway opened and it was a big success. In that same year, Glacier National Park was created by the government. A new vacation lodge was built at Rogers Pass inside the Glacier National Park, within reach of the railway. It was called Glacier House, and it was Canada's very first luxury mountain hotel. The Glacier House was a big success because everyone wanted to go up into the mountains. The Rocky Mountains here are some of the biggest and most impressive on the planet, and guides from Switzerland came down to work at the lodge and take people up the ice. But sadly, on March 4th, 1910, an unbelievably big avalanche killed 58 people in Rogers Pass. The Canadian Railway then decided they were going to build a bypass tunnel instead of going over Rogers Pass, and the railway line was abandoned by 1916. This left the Glacier House inaccessible until 1963, when the Trans-Canada Highway opened. Glacier House had already gone out of business. It's now a decrepit old ruin hiding way up in the mountains. Artifacts and melting glaciers. About 3,000 years ago, somebody was walking through the Jotunheimen Mountains when they lost a shoe. Whoever owned it probably didn't think they were ever going to get it back, and although they never found it again, archaeologists recovered it 3 millennia later in 2007. The shoe was discovered totally intact, frozen high up in the Norwegian mountains. That's not the only strange thing to have been discovered in a melting glacier in Norway. About 4,000 years ago, a red-winged thrush, a small bird, died in the mountain range and was immediately buried under ice and snow. When it emerged again just a couple of years ago, scientists found that its internal organs were still intact. Hundreds of these discoveries have been made in the last few years, and it's all because of melting ice patches. Norway's glaciers have revealed the remains of dead animals, the remnants of human activities, and even horse tracks frozen in the permafrost. According to Brigitte Skar, an associate professor at the NTNU University Museum, not a single year goes by without a surprising find. She says that based on satellite images from 2020, nearly 40% of the ice has melted, revealing all kinds of ancient history from the days of the Vikings and beyond. The oldest of all the finds is 6,100 years old. This artifact is an arrow shaft found at the same site as the shoe. It belonged to prehistoric people living in the world's most northerly reaches in the miserable cold. Mummified woolly mammoth. In Canada, a gold miner discovered a mummified woolly mammoth. It just happened in 2022 and is currently the most amazing woolly mammoth discovery in history. The young miner was digging through the permafrost near Eureka Creek, way up in the Canadian North, when he struck something unexpected. He got out of his truck to see what had happened, and that was when he found himself staring into the eyes of a baby woolly mammoth. It had been stuck in the ice for 35,000 years and was almost perfectly preserved. The Egyptians couldn't have done a better job at mummifying the baby elephant. According to paleontologist Grant Zazula, she is perfect and beautiful, and the most incredible Ice Age animal ever found. The woolly mammoth has most of her skin and hair still intact. She has her trunk and her tail, her floppy little baby ears, and even the prehensile end of her trunk, the part that was used to grab grass. It's such a miraculous discovery that it's hard to stop talking about it, as officials have even called the mammoth the most important paleontological discovery in North America. The woolly mammoth baby was little over a month old when she died, though no cause of death has been determined. That being said, researchers did discover a small piece of grass in her stomach. This suggests that her final moments had been spent grazing in the wild. We don't know if she was killed by a cave lion, a giant steppe bison, or even pummeled by a wild horse. Whatever happened, she got stuck under the ice almost immediately, and her body never decayed. The cover-up on Everest. A man named Mark Sinnott has made some pretty wild assertions regarding China and Mount Everest. Mark is an experienced climber, and his assertions revolve around the two British climbers George Mallory and Andrew Irvine. In 1924, George and Andrew tried to climb the north face of Mount Everest and went missing. They weren't seen again until Mallory's body was discovered 2,000 feet from the summit back in 1999, totally frozen over by the ice. Here's where things get spooky. Andrew's body was never found, and neither was the camera that the pair were carrying. The camera is important because it could have made all the difference to whether or not these two adventurers made it all the way to the top of Everest or not. Either they missed the peak by 800 feet and died in the snow, or they got to the top and died coming down. Nobody knows, but the film on the camera would probably prove it one way or the other. Mark has suggested that Andrew's body was indeed found by Chinese climbers, then disposed of, and the film destroyed. It's a pretty outrageous claim, though Mark says he has inside sources at the China-Tibet Mountaineering Association. If true, it would mean that George and Andrew were the very first people to reach the summit of Mount Everest 29 years before Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay, and the first to climb the North Face before a group of Chinese climbers did so in 1960. And now for number 5. But first, it's shout-out time! Big thank you to Nikki Thrailkill and Carrie Aubrey for supporting this channel. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already to join the Origins Explained family. We'd love to have you! Dinosaurs in Antarctica. A team of scientists recently discovered over a ton of fossils in Antarctica, one of the coldest places in the world. When I say a ton of fossils, I'm not talking metaphorically. I mean an actual ton of dinosaur remains. 12 scientists from all over the world, including from the US and South Africa, made the discovery on James Ross Island. This is located at the very edge of the Antarctic Peninsula. They discovered bones from plesiosaurs and mosasaurs. These were marine lizards that lived millions of years ago at a time when Antarctica was completely covered in water. While the gigantic marine beasts were the main success of the mission, there were plenty of other fossils found. The researchers even discovered fossilized birds, specifically fossilized prehistoric ducks from the Cretaceous period. Uchisar Castle. Uchisar Castle in Cappadocia, Turkey can be found at an astounding elevation of 4,170 feet. That's high enough that part of the year, this ancient castle is covered in heavy snow and looks like something out of a fantasy movie or a fairy tale. Uchisar is a town that came into being as early as the days of the Hittites 3,000 years ago. However, there is no record of the town existing until the 14th century. It's believed the Hittites used the cold caves high up in the mountains to hide from possible attacks. Then, the Byzantines used the chilly mountains as a buffer zone during the 7th century to try and ward off Islamic expansion. It didn't work, and the Islamists eventually took over the town and the castle. From a purely optical perspective, Uchisar is one of the most exotic-looking places on the planet. It looks like a city in the sky, with the rock castle towering over the valley city below, and the whole thing almost floating above the clouds. The castle is hardly what it used to be, as the caves and passages carved into the rock have partly melted or collapsed. It looks more like a sinking anthill than anything else. But still, it is a castle mountain, a castle that was carved from the top of this great and snowy peak to watch over the lands below. A cold massacre. 1,500 years ago, on the Swedish island of Öland, something terrible happened. This island is located a few miles off the coast of Sweden and is about as cold as it gets in Europe, with icy northern winds that make living here like living on the edge of a tornado. It was a brutal existence hundreds of years ago, not only because of the harsh weather, but because you never knew when you were going to be murdered. 1,500 years ago, there was a massacre. Evidence of it has been found at the site of Sandby Borg, currently a flat ruin with the remains of old stone sheep walls where the high ramparts used to be. The sheep walls were actually built using stones taken from the original fortress that stood in the same spot. The original structure was built in the year 400 and was about the size of a football field. There are roughly a dozen such remains on the island, left over from the migration period around the time of the Roman Empire's collapse. This was a rough time. People were fleeing Europe in all directions, were almost always under siege, and the people of Sandby Borg just wanted to live in their fortress and be left alone. Unfortunately, somebody broke through the walls, murdered everyone inside their homes, and left them dead on the floor. The place was then abandoned and left alone for years. The turf walls of the houses eventually collapsed, and the whole place turned into a shallow grave. Helena Victor from the Kalmar County Museum has called it a unique site because the attack was sudden and the settlement was never repopulated. Even though the others on the island would have known what happened, nobody entered the structure to bury the dead or even pillage what was left. It's a huge cold case, and nobody's sure who killed these people or why others on the island were too scared to bury the dead. 30 years of Ötzi. The most famous mummy in Europe was discovered high up in the Alps 30 years ago. He is 5,000 years old and is really the only actual caveman who's ever been discovered in a block of ice. It's like something from a cartoon, except very real. He was discovered lying in the ice at the edge of a lake 2 miles above sea level in the Alps bordering Austria and Italy. He was preserved thanks to the high altitude, lack of oxygen, freezing winds, and sub-zero temperatures. So just how much information have we learned about this person over the past 3 decades since he was brought down from the mountain? He's being kept by researchers at the South Tyrol Museum of Archaeology in Italy. Professionals have his body kept in a cold chamber maintained at approximately minus 21.2 degrees Fahrenheit. 5 times a year, his body is sprayed with sterile water to make sure he stays wet and cold. Oliver Pascal, the researcher in charge of the Iceman's conservation, has called him the most investigated human body in the world. So here are some facts we know about the world's only Iceman. He was pretty short, only about 5'2", and he was 46 when he died. He was left-handed, which might be the weirdest thing of all. He also wore a size 8 shoes. His eyes were brown, his hair was brown, and he had the classic tanned Mediterranean skin tone. Ötzi had type O blood, was intolerant to lactose, and was missing his 12th pair of ribs. He also had some cavities in his teeth, suffered from Lyme disease, had rough shoulders, hips, knees, and a bad back. And he had 61 tattoos. 5,200 years ago, it looks like tattoos were all the rage because Ötzi's entire body was basically covered in ink. The cold graves of warrior women. Archaeologists unearthed the graves of ancient Amazonian warrior women in the frozen tundra of Russia. The graves were found in the west, belonging to 4 Scythian warriors who ranged in age from between their teenage years to their late 40s. The women were buried with all the appropriate warriors' tools of the day, from spears to arrowheads, and even equipment for riding horses. The oldest woman was found still wearing a golden headdress known as a calathus. It's believed by almost every scholar and historian that the Scythians were a powerful tribe of warriors who trained both boys and girls to grow up as fighters. They were basically like the Spartans of the eastern steppes, nomads who lived throughout Russia and Kazakhstan in the cold and snowy hills. They were almost definitely the inspiration behind the Greek myth of Amazonia, the land of the warrior women. And they were the inspiration behind the modern comic book hero Wonder Woman. This has been the first time that direct evidence has been found of multiple generations of warrior women buried together. Researchers think that they all trained as young girls, and that the women may have been sisters or mothers and daughters. Thanks for watching! Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already, and come back soon for another awesome video. Bye!